Hello, this is Mark Tooley, president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy, and also editor of Providence, a journal of Christianity and American foreign policy. And I'm delighted to have a conversation with my friend Robert Reilly, who has just published a new book called, and Bob, remind me of the title,
America on Trial, A Defense of the Founding.
And hold it up for a moment, if you would, please.
Be delighted.
A very handsome book in appearance and no doubt also in content, and very timely in that the founding principles of America are very much under critique right now, not just from the usual quarters on the political and religious left, but also among some on the conservative religious side who believe that America's founding was secular and essentially poisonous fruit that leads inevitably to anarchy and decadence and chaos. And so Bob, with his new book, is making a very strong argument that no, America's founders were rooted in natural law, in Hebraic thought, in Christian thought, in the medieval church. In other words, a very sure foundation on which we can still call, and which is still has the capacity for renewal and is still an example for the world today. So Bob, it's great to have you with us today.
Thank you, Mark. It's a delight to be with you.
Please tell us a little bit about yourself, your current work, your professional background, and then finally we'll delve into your book.
Oh my. Well, I've labored in the groves of academia and also of government, the latter for a cumulative of 25 years in various government agencies, the U.S. Information Agency, the Defense Department, the State Department, the White House, not contiguously, but coming in and out of government several times, serving in several administrations. My background is in the subject of political philosophy. I went to graduate school at the Claremont Graduate University and was able to study with Harry V. Jaffa, one of the great defenders of the American founding and one of the most powerful exponents of natural law. So that helped shape my perspective on things. As you mentioned, I'm the director of the Westminster Institute, and in that capacity, we focus on the issues of religious freedom and political liberty, mainly in the Muslim world, which gives us plenty to do. Not exclusively, we've touched upon China and some other issues, but most of the focus is on the Muslim world and the problems facing it. And not surprisingly, and I know you're not surprised by this, one of the most essential problems in Islam, particularly in Sunni Islam, is the denial of natural law in their theology, which pretty much removes the foundation for democratic constitutional government, at least arising indigenously in such a culture. So, in one way or another, a lot of my work is focused on natural law, and my other books have also touched upon this subject in a variety of ways. Now, this one, as you mentioned, Mark, was instigated by the attacks on the founding, most especially coming from conservative religious circles. And I was particularly upset by some of the attacks, in the Catholic conservative realm. But it doesn't matter whether it's any Christian attack upon the founding that takes this particular tack. You mentioned it in brief, that the founding was an exclusive product of the radical Enlightenment, and therefore instilled in the founding the principles of radical individualism.
This is what the critics say.
This is what the critics say. And therefore, we today can explain the terrible moral degeneration into which this country has fallen. Rampant pornography, drugs, dissolution of the family, so-called same-sex marriage, transgender disfigurements, and all of this is a product, say these critics, of this radical individualism finally working its way through, so that we are the victims of a time-release poison pill that was implanted at the founding. So I wanted to take on this critique, and I did so, well, in a, not simply, this isn't just a polemical book trying to refute the arguments made by those critics, but it offers an alternate understanding of the roots of the United States that involved me really in a study of the development of Western civilization itself, starting from what the world was like before Greek philosophy, before Greek monotheism, Jewish monotheism, and before Christ. How did the world order itself and understand the universe without those three things? And then what sort of changes were occasioned by that discovery of Greek philosophy, that reality was apprehensible by our reason, that we could know the truth and not simply have opinions about things, and that indeed some of these truths were universal because there was a natural law that explained the order in the universe. And even more so, these early Greek philosophers speculated that behind this order we observe in nature, there must be a divine intelligence that imbued that order into things, and including man's reason that enabled him to apprehend this order and then to speculate as to what could be behind it. So they thought there's got to be a divine intelligence operating here. And so I think it was Heraclitus who first used the word logos in Greek to explain this. And we know the Greek word logos means reason or speech. So this divine reason and this natural law order through which we could come to understand the end of man, his natural purpose, and what human flourishing meant according to it. And all things have a nature with an end. And then, of course, this extraordinary instance of monotheism in Judaism, in a world immersed in a sea of polytheism. There was nothing to compare to the monotheism of the Jews, that there is actually this one God, and this God, in fact, is transcendent, and that he is created from nothing. There was nothing in any of the Middle Eastern cultures to compare to this, and that what God had made was good, that there wasn't a principle of evil contending with a principle of good that was fighting over creation and threatening to throw it back into primeval chaos. Jewish revelation rejected all of that, and most significantly said that man is made in the image and likeness of God. If there were any one statement that I would say is at the foundation of our civilization, it is that from Genesis. For we find in it the origin of the inviolability of the individual person. And then, of course, with the arrival of Christ, the most startling thing takes place that this logos, this reason that the Greeks held was the divine intelligence behind the order in the universe, this logos comes walking through the door. As we know, Christ is introduced in St. John. In the beginning was the Word, in the beginning was the logos, and the logos was God, and all things were created through him as logos. That explains God himself is reason. And now in Christ, logos is incarnate and enters into creation, not simply to be reasonable, but to reveal God's heart and essence as love itself. And Christ undertakes the sacrificial act for the redemption of mankind that puts each individual in a direct relationship with God. This was unheard of in the ancient world. Man in the ancient polis or the empires had no direct access to God. It was only through the divine or semi-divine rulers of the polis or the empire, the divine pharaoh. He is the one who had access to the gods and through whom supplications needed to be made. And only your proximity to this divine ruler gave you any hope of having your prayers answered. You certainly had no relationship with the divine as an individual person. So you can imagine the revolutionary character of Christianity when it introduces this notion. And it takes that Genesis revelation that man is made in the image and likeness of God and universalizes it, expands it to form a foundation of man's equality and inviolability that is even more profound because it's revealed that man is the object of God's infinite love and mercy, and therefore can't be instrumentalized, made an instrument for the achievement of someone else's passions or goals. These three things, of course, maybe this sounds a little distant from the American founding, but they're actually foundation stones to it, without which it would never have happened. I then spend some considerable time showing how this had an impact on the development of constitutional principles in the Middle Ages, which also was dealing with that statement by Christ when he examined the denarius: give to Caesar the things that are Caesar's and to God the things that are God. Another revolutionary statement that some things aren't Caesar's. So that there was a dual sovereignty. Certainly Caesar had a legitimate sovereignty, but God did too. So there were two realms, the spiritual and the secular. Now, this was by Pope Gelasius articulated as the two swords teaching, as he instructed the emperor at the time. I wouldn't try to interfere in your secular rule, and nor should you interfere in the spiritual rule of the church. Now, in the Middle Ages, they tried to instantiate this dual sovereignty. And the product of it was, let us say, a greater freedom for the individual, because this dual sovereignty was exercised over the same people. And therefore, neither of these sovereignties could claim the whole person. The secular ruler could not claim to rule him in spiritual matters, and the spiritual order could not claim to rule him in secular matters. And in fact, they had separate courts, separate institutions. And man, it was protected in a way. Let's say that the sphere of freedom grew. And out of it, particularly in canon law, uh, we see the development of the principles of democratic constitutional rule, the first of which is the sovereignty of the people. Everyone agreed that God gives all authority, including political authority. The question was, how does that authority arrive? Does God assign it directly to the ruler or to the people? And the unanimous decision and the understanding, rather, in the Middle Ages was that the people are sovereign. And the ruler receives his authority as delegated by the people and on certain grounds in terms of a compact that ruler must observe. He is never outside or above the laws, and those laws must be consented to by the people over whom they exercise authority. And of course, you see here the development of the equality before the law. Now, there was another principle that the canonists took from Roman law, that what affects all must be approved by all. And this, you see an early articulation of the no taxation without representation principle. So if the people are sovereign, their consent in their rule is required. Equality requires consent. And this became particularly keenly exercised exactly in matters of taxation. People couldn't be taxed without their consent. This is, as I say, first was exercised within the church, particularly religious orders like the Dominicans, who elected their abbots, who had convocations to which representatives would be sent with the understanding that whatever they decided would be exactly what would rule things. Even church conclaves adopted the 2/3 rule. And so canonists, of course, were clerics, but they didn't work only in the church, they worked in the courts, the secular courts and the royal courts. And what you saw was these principles of sovereignty, equality, consent, representation, were leached. They was a pure, like osmosis from the sacred into the secular order, and this led to the early development of parliaments.
Bob, let me take a pause there, if we may. You've given us
a lot of material to chew on. Too long of an answer, Mark. I apologize.
A very rich response there. I think we have failed to actually mention the name of your book, so if you would hold it up for us to see.
Be delighted.
Excellent. And that's now available on Amazon, I assume.
Yes, and from the publisher at an even better price, Ignatius Press.
And some of your blurbs come from some familiar names. I believe was Robbie George on there?
Robbie George isn't there, but Larry Arnn, who's the president of Hillsdale College, of course, he wrote the foreword to it. Peter Kreeft, who is a famous apologist and philosopher, Robert Reilly, Benjamin Weicker at Franciscan University, Austin Roos, and so forth.
Sure.
So, yeah, that's delightful.
So you're making the argument that the founders were rooted in natural law, in Hebraic thought, in early Christian thought, the medieval church. I'm sure you get around to the influence of the Reformation at some point. So the critics of the founders, Patrick Deneen's book, The End of Liberalism, in essence, what are they saying that you think is inaccurate in terms of correctly understanding the founders and what was behind them historically?
Well, thank you for giving a tight summation of my case. That is what I argue, that the principles of the founding are rooted in those very things. And the case that Deneen makes and others is that no, it's not, that it's a product of radical modernity, which was an explicit break with all those things, and that modernity is based upon the primacy of will, not of reason. So it flips exactly the very kind of thing about which I was talking at the heart of Western civilization. Now, I think Deneen and others are absolutely right that there is a break in radical modernity. And I ask in the book, how is it that these principles of constitutional rule and popular sovereignty, requirement of consent, and by the way, the right to revolution, why weren't they just developed continuously from the Middle Ages through to the period of the 18th century? That's because there was a break that was represented in the absolutism of the 16th and 17th century, with rulers claiming, on the one hand, that the divine right of kings, that they are appointed directly by God, that the people are not sovereign, that they are not accountable to the people, and that they are above the law. Since they make the law, they are not accountable to the law. And you see these radical claims of divine right in someone like James I in England, and other rulers obviously Louis XIV was the famous instance of divine right of rule claims. And you had a secular absolutist claim to political rule and I used the thought of Thomas Hobbes to show what that means and how it was developed. And there again, you have an instance of an absolute sovereign, who's sovereign, by the way, not only on secular things, but on religious things as well. Just as James I said, I'm the head of the church, Hobbes's Leviathan said it is the sovereign who will decide, what's a miracle and what's not the church, the sovereign. So the two swords, the dual sovereignty was lost. Now man was subject to an all-powerful single sovereignty. And that was the break. And of course, it was exacerbated by the Enlightenment. In fact, it was to a certain extent a product of the Enlightenment. And it was reacted against by very significant Catholic and Protestant thinkers and philosophers and theologians who appealed back to these medieval principles and to natural law and to Aristotle and to Aquinas in defense of them. So they were kind of holding the fort intellectually against these claims. Now, just to fast forward to the American founding, what the colonists tried first to do was make a claim that they simply wished to exercise the rights of Englishmen, which by royal charter they were supposed to have. But the British Parliament by that time had assumed the divine right of kings, except now it was the divine right of the British Parliament. And in the Declaratory Act, they said we may pass whatever laws we wish concerning any matter whatsoever regarding the colonies without their consent. Well, this was a violation of that principle. What affects all must be agreed to by all. It was a violation of the sovereignty of the people, which the colonists thought resided in them and in their equality. So their appeal moved from the rights of Englishmen to the universal rights as enunciated in the preamble of the Declaration of Independence, that they made their appeal upon natural law and natural rights on transcendent truths, truths that obtain everywhere at all times for everyone. And that is where they took their stand. And the case I make in the book is what you see in the American founding is a reconnection with that lineage of natural law, transcendent Christian and Judaic and Greek thought. It's a restoration of what was lost during the period of absolutism. It was a reestablishment of these things. So to say that, and this, by the way, is what they thought they were doing. And the authorities to which they appealed explicitly to Aristotle, to Cicero, and of course to Christianity, to the right to revolution, the right of representation, the right of consent. We all know these, they're so well articulated in our founding documents. So I make the case that, of course, these have a Christian foundation. Now, you wouldn't say that the founding itself is Christian because it appeals to universal principles that are obtainable through the exercise of reason. And they apply not simply to Christians, but to any man, to any person, which is why in this country we can have people of other religions living peaceably together because we acknowledge these principles through our reason. But my case is that this philosophical truth would never have become so widely recognized or embraced if it were not present in the revelation that was shared by, I mean, to say the vast majority of American people is an understatement, because the country was almost totally Christian. So the combination, the confidence you see that the colonists could have in the articulation of the philosophical principles they saw in the Declaration and the founding was reinforced by the fact that it was undergirded by the revelation in which they believed.
Well, Bob, your book sounds absolutely fascinating, and I can't wait to read it. It's obviously extremely timely. If you know some of our history at the IRD, we were founded because many in American Christianity, at least church elites, were questioning the ongoing validity of American democracy 40 years ago, and we're succumbing to the Marxist temptation. Now we have fellow Christians in America, again, expressing doubts in democracy, but coming from the right and not the far left. So another very different challenge to which you're responding. So thank you so much. I have so many more questions for you, but we're already at 30 minutes, so maybe we could have another conversation sometime soon.
Would love to, Mark. Thank you very much.
And we'll have to get together for lunch sometime when we're allowed to.
Exactly. Look forward to it.
All right. Thank you, Bob. Take care.
Thank you so much. Take care. Bye-bye.